So I was covering the Syria crisis from more or less its inception, the summer of 2011, long before there was any ISIS presence in Syria, or at least an acknowledged, declared presence. And I got to know a lot of the opposition, which in the beginning had been peaceful protesters and activists. When it became an armed rebellion against the Assad regime, I started to do a lot of reporting from the Syrian-Turkish border, meeting with refugees, meeting with rebels, because you have to understand southern Turkey has become a kind of barracks for this revolution, for this rebellion. In the summer of 2012, actually it was Ramadan, I went into Aleppo with the Free Syrian Army convoy, just as the city, or parts of the city, the northeastern quadrant, had been liberated from the Assad regime, and spent the night in a town about an hour's drive north of Aleppo city called Al-Bab. Stayed with a family. The owner of the house was a Syrian rebel. Spent the night there. So did a few other journalists of my acquaintance. And it was extraordinary because I had seen firsthand. You know, it's one thing to open up the New York Times or turn on CNN and see images broadcast from thousands of miles away, but you really have to see it, you know, for yourself to understand what's sort of the driving force behind this rebellion. And it was amazing because at night, these rebels put down their guns, picked up white gloves and garbage bags, and were cleaning the rubble from the streets because the Assad government was bombarding civilian infrastructure. They actually targeted the hospital in the town so that any activists, civilians, or rebels who were injured or you know, really badly wounded could not be treated. So, you know, these guys, I mean, it was extraordinary. They turned a mosque into a makeshift hospital, imported all the viable equipment in there, and they were treating everybody. They were treating pro-government militiamen and pro-government fighters equally with Syrian rebels. And I know that might sound a little propagandistic, but I also saw that with my own eyes. About 5 to 6 months later, the town I stayed in, Al-Bab, had gone over to ISIS. It was completely taken over. The house I stayed in is now controlled by ISIS. The family that I stayed with fled the country. They went into Turkey. And so I watched in real time this degeneration of what had started out as, I think, a very noble and dignified rebellion against a brutal totalitarian government, and like many revolutions, had become sort of almost the parallel image of what it aimed to overthrow, or what it aimed to reject. And my co-author, Hassan Hassan, is actually a Syrian national. He comes from a town in Deir Zor, which is the eastern province of Syria. The town's called Abu Kamal. To put this in context, this is a gateway town between Syria and Iraq, which for the better part of 10 years had been a sort of traffic point for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the jihadist group that is now known as ISIS. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was their original incarnation. So it sort of has a relationship as being the kind of Juarez to El Paso, if you like, those of you who were in Texas, so you know the Mexican drug cartels. So Hassan comes from a Syrian tribe, has a very extended family network. He knows everybody, and his family knows everybody basically in this region. So for the purposes of doing this book, we thought we're not going to write a book about ISIS unless we could actually interview guys in ISIS, right? You have to understand the nature of an enemy if you have any desire to defeat it. So we got these interviews with a lot of fighters at the lower ranking levels, but even more important than that, their family members. You know, how comes it that a guy who, you know, a 16-year-old boy who is studying chemical engineering or electrical engineering, wanting to live in the West, decides to cast his lot with a bunch of head-lopping barbarians? You know, what is the driving mechanism behind this? So the purpose of writing this book is to try and explain, by no means justify, but to give an explanation and an account for the rise of this terror army, which, I mean, by last geographical calculus, now controls a swath of terrain in the Middle East, roughly the size of Great Britain. And the other purpose, I should just add, is, you know, I did a lot of media in June of 2014 when ISIS stormed Mosul, thus inaugurating this so-called Operation Inherent Resolve, the coalition war. And the question I kept getting asked on TV was, where did they come from? You know, how did these guys just emerge from nowhere? And it sounded like the most absurd question I'd ever heard. I mean, in the book we say, imagine it's 1985 and the Viet Cong have conquered a third of Southeast Asia, but they just don't call themselves the Viet Cong. Everybody's scratching their heads saying, where did they come from? Who is this enemy? They're inscrutable and unknown to us. ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2003 to 2004, really, up until, well, now, they have been a primary enemy and primary target of the United States and its allies in the region. So they've just changed their branding and their marketing, and their strategy has evolved in a very dire and sophisticated manner, which makes them thus all the greater to defeat. So a lot of this book is a work of history. We go back to the early origins of the terrorist organization. The founder of the feast, if you like, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian jailbird who went into Iraq after the coalition campaign in Afghanistan. He had been in Afghanistan. He fled. First he spent time in Iran and Syria, went to Iraq, and essentially set up this organization, which didn't start as an al-Qaeda franchise, but became one after a series of spectacular terror attacks targeting the United Nations, the Jordanian embassy. So we wanted to sort of give, the average reader, people who are interested in the subject matter, because let's face it, we all have targets on our backs. Right? I mean, these guys, if they had their druthers, they would bomb this book festival, they would fly planes into our buildings, they would do everything they possibly can to try and bleed and humiliate and abase the United States and, frankly, every civilized country in the world, and some not-so-civilized countries. So this is sort of a broad history, but it culminates, I think, with very sort of in-depth reporting and profiles of essentially who these guys are and what they want, which may be even more important.